The air was thin and freezing at 25,000 feet over the English Channel. For Second Lieutenant Bill Harris of the U.S. Army Air Forces, every breath was a conscious effort, a ragged gasp of oxygen through his rubber mask. His knuckles were white as he gripped the control stick of his Bell P-39 Airacobra. Below him, the water was a cold, indifferent slate of gray. Above him was death. It came in the form of a single, yellow-nosed Messerschmitt Bf 109. The German fighter was a predator in its natural element, carving graceful, effortless arcs in the high, clear air. Harris's P-39, by contrast, felt like a drowning man. The Allison engine, a powerful V-12, was gasping, its performance strangled by the lack of a proper high-altitude supercharger. It was a flaw Harris could feel in his bones. The controls felt mushy, unresponsive. The plane wallowed, refusing climb, refusing to turn with any authority. The German pilot knew it, too. He wasn't even rushing the kill. He was toying with him, making lazy, contemptuous passes, staying just out of range of the Airacobra's sluggish guns, a shark circling a bleeding swimmer. Harris felt a surge of pure, impotent rage. On the ground, his plane was a marvel. It looked like the future, with its sleek automotive lines, its car-style doors, and its revolutionary tricycle landing gear. It was built around the single most terrifying weapon fitted to any fighter in the sky, a massive 37mm cannon, a piece of artillery mounted in the nose, firing through propeller hub. It was supposed to be a bomber killer, a high-tech wonder. But up here, where the war was actually being fought, it was a joke, a coffin, an iron dog. The Bf 109 finally tired the game. It dipped its nose, and in a heartbeat, it was on his tail. Harris threw the stick, trying to brake, but the P-39 responded with a sickening shudder. The chatter of the Germans' cannons was like a hammer blow on his fuselage. The canopy shattered. The instrument panel exploded in a shower of glass and sparks. Harris knew he was done. He had been sent to fight a war in a plane that was fundamentally, fatally broken. What Harris and hundreds of other Allied pilots didn't know was that the P-39 wasn't born failure. It was a victim of a brilliant idea undone by a catastrophic decision. The aircraft was the brainchild of Bell Aircraft's founder, Larry Bell. He envisioned a fighter built not around the pilot, but around the gun. The entire design was subservient to that massive 37mm cannon. To accommodate it in the nose, the engine was moved to the middle of the fuselage, right behind the pilot, like a race car. This gave the plane excellent balance and visibility. The original prototype, the XP-39, was a world beater. Fitted with a turbo supercharger, it screamed across the sky at nearly 400 miles per hour and could operate well above 30,000 feet. It was exactly what America needed to challenge the best fighters in Europe. And then came the committee. In one of the most infamous decisions in aviation history, the U.S. Army Air Corps, obsessed with low to medium altitude performance, ordered Bell to remove the complex and costly turbo supercharger system and replace it with a simpler, single-stage gear-driven supercharger that was only effective below 15,000 feet. They had, in effect, taken a thoroughbred racehorse and surgically removed its lungs. The production P-39 Airacobra was the result. It was a plane neutered, crippled before it ever saw combat. The British were the first to find out. Eager for any modern fighter, they ordered hundreds under the name Caribou. RAF pilots, accustomed to the superb high-altitude performance of the Spitfire, were horrified. The P-39 couldn't climb, it couldn't turn, and it couldn't fight above 20,000 feet. After flying a single disastrous combat mission, the RAF rejected the plane outright, labeling it unfit for service. The unwanted fighters were sent back, their reputation in tatters. For American pilots, the story was the same. They were thrown into the meat grinder of the Pacific in Europe in a plane that was outclassed by its opponents. In New Guinea, they faced the nimble Japanese Zero, a master of the dogfight. In Europe, they faced the superb Bf 109 and FW 190. In every theater, the verdict was the same. The P-39 was a dud. Its kill-to-loss ratio was abysmal. Squadrons transitioned to the P-47 Thunderbolt or the P-51 Mustang as fast as they could, leaving the Airacobra behind like a bad memory. By 1943, America had thousands of these brand new, unwanted fighters sitting on airfields, collecting dust. They were a testament to a failed design philosophy, a resource squandered. They were a punchline. But half a world away, another of America's allies was not laughing. The Soviet Union was fighting for its very existence. In the brutal, sprawling war on the Eastern Front, they weren't just losing battles. They were losing a generation. Their air force had been decimated in the opening days of Operation Barbarossa, and they were desperate. They needed fighters. They needed guns. They needed anything that could fly and kill Germans. And America had thousands of planes nobody else wanted. Under the Lend-Lease program, a lifeline of military aid to allies, the first crated P-39 Airacobras began their long, perilous journey. Packed onto freighters, they braved the treacherous Arctic convoys, hunted by German U-boats and bombers, or were flown the long way across Africa and Iran. Most in the U.S. command saw it as a way to get rid of useless inventory. They were sending their worst fighter to the Eastern Front. They had no idea they were about to arm their ally with the perfect weapon for a different kind of war. The first P-39s that arrived in the Soviet Union were met with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Soviet pilots, like Lieutenant Alexander Pokrishkin, were accustomed to their own rugged, no-frills fighters like the Yak-1 or the Lag-3. These were simple wooden machines, often underpowered and lightly armed, but they were tough. When Pokrishkin, a thoughtful and analytical pilot who was already showing signs of tactical genius, first laid eyes on the Airacobra, he was struck by its alien design. The tricycle landing gear was a novelty, a luxury on the muddy, primitive airfields of the front. The car doors were a bizarre curiosity. The cockpit was a revelation. Compared to Spartan, utilitarian interiors of his Yak, the P-39's cockpit was a palace of modern technology. It had a full suite of instruments, a comfortable seat, and even a cockpit heater, an unimaginable luxury for pilots used to freezing in their drafty cabins. But it was the radio that truly stunned them. Soviet aircraft were notoriously equipped with poor-quality radios, if they had them at all. Communication in a dogfight was often limited to hand signals and wing waggles. The P-39, however, came with a superb American VHF radio set. For the first time, a squadron leader could actually command his flight in real time, directing his wingmen, calling out targets and coordinating attacks with precision. For a tactical innovator like Pokrishkin, this wasn't just a convenience. It was a revolution. It was a key to unlocking the kind of sophisticated, layered air combat he had only dreamed of. Yet, for all the comforts and technological marvels, the initial combat reports were not promising. Soviet pilots, just like their American and British counterparts, tried to fly the P-39 like a conventional fighter. They tried to climb and engage German fighters at medium to high altitudes. And they paid the price. The plane's weaknesses were immediately apparent. It was slow to climb. It performed poorly above 15,000 feet. In a turning dogfight with a nimble Bf-109, it was a losing proposition. The old criticism seemed to be true. The Americans had sent them a lemon. The nickname, Iron Dog, began to circulate among the disillusioned Soviet squadrons. But the nature of the war on the Eastern Front was fundamentally different from the war in the West. This was not a strategic bombing campaign with high-altitude escort duels. This was total war. The air war was inextricably linked to the titanic struggle happening on the ground. The primary mission of the Soviet Air Force was not to gain air superiority for its own sake, but to protect their ground troops and destroy the enemies. This meant flying low. It meant strafing enemy columns, bombing troop concentrations, and most importantly, hunting the terror of the steppes, the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka bomber. At low altitude, below 15,000 feet, the P-39 Airacobra was not a dog. It was a different animal entirely. In the thick, dense air of the lower atmosphere, the Allison engine, unburdened by the need for a high-altitude supercharger, delivered its full power. The plane was fast, agile, and responsive. Its sluggishness melted away. Pokrishkin and a few other forward-thinking pilots were the first to realize this. They stopped trying to fight the Germans' war. They started fighting their own. They developed new tactics, built around the P-39's unique strengths. They refused to be lured into high-altitude dogfights. Instead, they used a slash-and-run tactic, using the Airacobra's impressive speed at low altitude to make fast, devastating passes on German bomber formations. And then there was the gun, that glorious, ridiculous 37mm cannon. American pilots had found it difficult to use. Its rate of fire was slow, around 3 rounds per second, and it carried limited ammunition. Its trajectory was different from the .50 caliber machine guns, making it hard to aim, but the Soviets saw its potential. They were masters of deflection shooting, and they quickly learned to harness the cannon's power. A single hit from one of its high-explosive shells was not just a kill, it was an obliteration. A Stuka, a Heinkel bomber, even a twin-engine Ju-88, would simply disintegrate when struck by a 37mm round. It was the ultimate bomber killer, just as its designers had intended, as long as the fight was on its terms. Pokrishkin championed the plane. He wrote new training manuals, drilling his pilots to fight exclusively at low and medium altitudes. He perfected a tactic he called the Kuban Shelf, a stacked formation of P-39s at different altitudes, allowing him to control a huge swath of airspace and ambush German formations from above. His squadron, equipped with a failed American fighter, began to rack up an astonishing number of kills. The turning point in the P-39's reputation came during the titanic Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943. The Germans had amassed their finest Panzer divisions for a massive offensive, supported by a huge concentration of Luftwaffe aircraft. It was here in the skies over the Kursk salient that the Soviet Air Force, flying hundreds of P-39s, met them head-on. A typical mission for a Soviet P-39 pilot like Grigory Rechkalov, another future ace, would begin with a scramble from a dusty grass airfield. His target wasn't enemy fighters. His target was a formation of Stuka dive bombers heading to attack Soviet trenches. Rechkalov and his squadron would climb to 10,000 feet, positioning themselves between the sun and the incoming Germans. As the Stukas began their telltale dives, he would roll his Airacobra over and plummet down on them. He ignored the escorting German fighters, leaving them to another squadron of P-39s flying top cover. His focus was singular. He picked out a Stuka, its gull wings iconic and unmistakable. He closed the distance at over 400 miles per hour. A quick burst from his .50 caliber machine, guns to get the range, and then a single, deliberate press of the trigger for the cannon. The P-39 bucked as the 37mm shell left the barrel. He saw the flash on the Stuka's wing root. The wing simply tore away from the fuselage, and the German dive bomber tumbled out of the sky, a broken toy. He pulled up, firewalled the throttle, and raced away at treetop level. The speed and ruggedness of the P-39 carried him back to safety. For the German pilots, this was a new and terrifying experience. The sky was no longer their exclusive domain. It was now infested with these fast, heavily armed American fighters that refused to play by the old rules. They would appear out of nowhere, deliver a devastating blow with their cannons, and vanish before the German fighter escorts could effectively react. The P-39 had found its perfect ecosystem. It was the apex predator of the low-altitude war. They called it the Kabushka, the little cobra. It was a name spoken not with derision, but with a mixture of affection and deadly respect. The joke was over. The Iron Dog had learned how to bite. The love affair between Soviet pilots and the P-39 Airacobra was not just about tactics. It was about philosophy. The Russian approach to warfare was one of brutal practicality. They valued effectiveness and survivability above all else. The P-39 delivered on both. Its rugged, all-metal airframe and sturdy tricycle landing gear made it exceptionally resilient. It could absorb an astonishing amount of punishment and still bring its pilot home. It could operate from the worst airfields imaginable, muddy tracks, frozen fields, and hastily cleared patches of forest that would have torn the landing gear off a more delicate aircraft like a Spitfire. There are countless stories of Soviet P-39s returning to base riddled with holes, trailing smoke, with entire sections of their tail or wings shot away. The mid-engine design, initially just a way to accommodate the cannon, turned out to be a massive advantage for pilot survivability. With the solid engine block between the pilot and any attack from the rear, it acted as a giant piece of armor, protecting them from cannon shells and machine gun fire that would have been fatal in a conventional fighter. This toughness earned the undying loyalty of its pilots. They knew their Kabushka would take care of them, but it was the offensive power that made them legends. The Soviets didn't just use the P-39 against aircraft. They quickly realized that the 37mm cannon was a superb ground attack weapon. They began to use the Airacobra as a flying tank buster. While the cannon couldn't penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger or a Panther tank, a direct hit on the thinner top, side, or rear armor could be devastating. More often, it was used against softer targets with spectacular results. A single cannon shell could obliterate a German supply truck, a staff car, or a towed artillery piece. It could destroy a locomotive, bringing an entire supply train to a halt. Soviet pilots would return from missions with their cannon ammunition expended, having wreaked havoc on German supply lines miles behind the front. The P-39 became an integral part of the Soviet combined arms doctrine. As the Red Army began its great push westward, driving the Germans out of Russia and back toward Berlin, the Airacobras flew ahead of them. They were the aerial vanguard, clearing the way for the advancing tanks and infantry. They hunted German troop concentrations, strafe retreating columns, and ensured that the Luftwaffe could not effectively intervene to stop the Soviet juggernaut. Alexander Pokrishkin became the ultimate master of the P-39. He was not a natural stick and rudder man, but a cold, calculating tactician. He studied his enemies, analyzed their weaknesses, and developed his strategies with the precision of a chess master. His official tally of 59 victories, almost all of them achieved while flying the P-39, made him one of the highest-scoring Allied aces of the war. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, his country's highest honor, 3 times. But his real contribution was his influence. As a commander, he trained a generation of Soviet pilots in his methods, turning entire regiments into elite killer units, all flying the P-39. Another top ace, Grigory Rechkalov, was the opposite of Pokrishkin. He was a flamboyant, aggressive, and instinctive fighter who flew by the seat of his pants. With 56 victories to his name, most also in the P-39, he proved that the aircraft could be just as deadly in the hands of a gifted dogfighter, as long as the pilot was smart enough to keep the fight at low altitude. The list of Soviet P-39 aces is staggering. Dozens of pilots achieved ace status flying the Iron Dog. In fact, of the top 10 Soviet aces of the war, 7 of them flew the P-39 for a significant portion of their careers. The very same aircraft that was deemed a failure by the British and a death trap by the Americans was the chosen mount of champions on the Eastern Front. The Germans on the receiving end learned to fear it. Luftwaffe pilots, confident in their superior aircraft and training, were constantly baffled and frustrated. They would engage what they thought would be an easy kill, only to have the P-39 pilot dive for the deck, where their own plane performance advantages evaporated. They learned to respect the devastating punch of the 37mm cannon, giving the P-39 a wide berth. German ground troops came to dread the distinctive, throaty roar of the P-39's Allison engine, knowing it was often the prelude to a sudden, violent, and explosive death from the sky. News of the P-39's incredible success on the Eastern Front filtered back to the United States, where it was met with a degree of bewilderment. American commanders and aircraft designers struggled to understand how their worst fighter had become a war-winning weapon. Some attributed it to the lower quality of German pilots on the Eastern Front, a convenient but inaccurate excuse. Others claimed the Soviets were simply using brute force, accepting huge losses to achieve their objectives. The truth was far more nuanced. The Soviets hadn't just used the P-39, they had understood it. They recognized its flaws, but instead of discarding it, they built a new combat doctrine around its unique strengths. They didn't try to force the square peg of the Airacobra into the round hole of Western air combat philosophy. They found a square hole where it fit perfectly. They accepted the plane for what it was, a low-altitude brawler with a cannon that could fell a giant, and they used it with a brilliance and ruthlessness that changed the course of the war in the air. The laughter had stopped. The shame and embarrassment that had surrounded the P-39 program in America was replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. The unwanted child had found a home where it was not only accepted, but celebrated as a hero. The Iron Dog, once scorned and rejected, was now the personal weapon of the Soviet Union's greatest eagles, a key instrument in the destruction of the Third Reich. Its journey from failure to legend was almost complete. By 1944, as the Red Army closed on the borders of Germany, the legend of the P-39 was firmly cemented in Soviet military lore. Over 4,700 Airacobras served on the Eastern Front, more than in all other Allied air forces combined. They had flown in every major engagement from the defense of Moscow to the final assault on Berlin. The pilots who flew them were national heroes, their faces plastered on propaganda posters, their exploits recounted in newspapers. The Babushka had become a symbol of Soviet resilience and, ironically, a symbol of the surprising effectiveness of the alliance with capitalist America. The relationship, however, was not without its quirks. Soviet mechanics, masters of improvisation, had to learn how to service the complex Allison engine and the unfamiliar American systems. They became adept at keeping the planes fly with a mixture of official spare parts, cannibalized wrecks, and pure ingenuity. There were complaints, of course. The engine was sensitive to dust and cold.